44 minutes after the hour in America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. David Drucker is senior political writer for The Dispatch. David, another slow news day. Donald Trump has sprung Nick Fogel from Russia. Mark Fogel. He's on his way home with Steve Witkoff. Zelensky gave an interview to The Guardian saying he's open to a land swap, giving up the Kursk salient for land that Russia invaded. And of course, we don't have a constitutional crisis, but we got a lot of court suits. What's your overall assessment as we begin week 4?
I mean, more of the same, right? I mean, there's just this administration from the last administration is much more active, but it's also just different, right? And so whenever you go from one party to the next, especially in the very beginning, you're going to see a lot of change. And look, Trump in particular this time around is probably doing what he conceptually or philosophically wanted to do the first time around when he was president before, but didn't really know how to do and didn't have the team around him that was going to affect the sorts of disruptive things he wanted. So, none of this is surprising me. I listened to him on the campaign trail. I believed it, and he's following through.
The most obvious thing I think he's learned is that if you can get someone confirmed to an executive level 1 job, Secretary of State, they can take any other EL job as acting, like Archivist of the United States. So Marco Rubio is both Secretary of State and the Archivist of the United States. And Russ Vought is Director of OMB, and he's the acting director of the Consumer Finance Protection Agency. He's learned some of the tricks. It's sort of like a developer is a learning machine. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, David. Do you?
Yeah, I would suspect so. I mean, obviously, at some point, some of this stuff might run afoul of statute, and if Congress cares to do anything about it, that could cause that could put a little obstacle in the president's way. We're seeing people attempt to use the courts to get in the president's way. That's hardly anything new. This president, the last president, the first Trump presidency, the Obama presidency. But I just think this time around, the president he appears to have a better understanding of what he wants to do and how he wants to do it. And for people that disagree with his agenda, that's going to be quite frustrating. For people who support his agenda, that's going to be heartening.
Now, David Drucker, last night, Caitlin Collins on CNN, and Brian Stelter reposted it, said, some are saying we are dangerously close to a constitutional crisis. Well, some people are saying anything at any time. That's just dumb. It's ridiculous, actually. And I just talked about it with Noah Rothman. The editor's podcast at National Review is devoted. We haven't had a constitutional crisis, a real one, since the Civil War. The court packing plan that FDR proposed in 1937 would have been a constitutional crisis had it passed because it would overturn the rule of law. But I mean, really, shouldn't we just stop this? It's just a bunch of lawsuits about what can and cannot be done. No one's denying the right of the court to review or failing to conform behavior to court rulings.
Yeah, listen, look, I would say, and I've talked to voters about this, I've talked to people in Washington about this. There are some people that believe that we're in a sort of brewing constitutional crisis. As I often tell people, wait for something to happen before you determine that something is a crisis. I do think it's fair to say that the Trump administration, that President Trump is stretching the bounds of executive authority even more than his predecessors did, meaning he's hardly the first president to stretch the bounds of executive authority. Presidents love their authority, as opposed to Congress, who seems to want nothing to do with their authority. He seems to be stretching it more than his predecessors. The judicial branch is happy to stretch its bounds of authority as well, and it is responding to President Trump by doing some of that. The judiciary has never been shy about stretching the bounds of its authority. It's where the term activist courts comes from. If you're on the left, you think the right's been activist and vice versa. I don't think we're in the midst of some full-blown crisis. And I've told people, again, wait for one to happen before you call it that.
And we're not going to have one. Donald Trump has never defied a court order. He showed up in the New York courtroom and sat there through a kangaroo court for I don't know how many days. David, let's turn to what might be a world crisis, not a constitutional crisis, but a world crisis. On Saturday, 7 p.m. in Israel, noon American time, if I understand the president right, all hell's going to break loose unless 76 hostages or their bodies are returned. What do you think is going to happen?
I have no idea, but clearly the president seems to have established some sort of what we like to refer to in these situations as a red line. And so either Hamas is going to not test him or they're going to test him. I do think it's curious. The president was responsible through his envoy Witkoff, working, in the last days of the Biden administration with a deal where you had people released a little at a time, a little at a time. And then he ruffled, he messed up his own deal by declaring he wanted to move the Palestinians out of Gaza, not let them return ever. The U.S. would take control of Gaza. All of this has been very nebulous. It's caused tensions in the region with our own allies. But if they were going to do this deal and have Israel release hundreds of prisoners per every Israeli or American returned, they should have just not done any of that and said, release them all or else. Because now what you have a situation where you have hundreds of terrorists back out on the streets, so to speak, and the deal's going to fall apart. And even if the deal doesn't fall apart completely, if you could have done this or else thing, you should have just done it from the beginning.
Well, I don't know whether it was option. I think Trump is reacting as Trump does to the visuals. Some people learn by reading, some people learn by dialogue like Bill Clinton. Other people are impacted by images more than anything. Nelson Rockefeller, Donald Trump come to mind. The images of those three hostages obviously struck the president as beyond the pale, sort of like the Syrian children being gassed in his first term. I think all hell's
Well,
going to
yeah,
break loose on Saturday.
I understand that, but I mean, this has been beyond the pale from the beginning. And so sometimes the president gets a little over his skis and undermines his own goals. And I think, this might be one of those instances. I mean, his Middle East policy overall is an improvement from the previous administration and has been one of the areas in which he was strong, even in the first term when he was still sort of figuring out the contours of the job. I'm just saying, if this is how it was going to go down, either let the deal, come to its conclusion and then move on to the next step afterward, or don't bother at all, and you still have hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian terrorists still in jail.
David M. Drucker, always good to hear from you, writing for The Dispatch. You're a senior political writer. We appreciate your joining us.